Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. The 15-member Afghanistan Study Group, which is a bipartisan group, has released a report in the United States. This is a group that had been set up by the U.S. Congress, in part to obviously look at the involvement of the United States in Afghanistan, the ongoing involvement, we should say. It has recommended that the May 1st deadline, which had been set, be extended, so U.S. troops not withdraw on May 1st, but in fact stay and extend their deadline till such time that the Taliban and the Afghan government do enter into talks and carry out those talks in a successful fashion. It also says that the goal of this is not just to defeat the likes of ISIS and Al-Qaeda, but as I said, to ensure that the peace process does move forward in a satisfactory fashion. Let's discuss that further. We're now joined by Sangar Paykhar, who is a graduate of the School of Governance and Global Affairs at The Hague. He's a journalist and host of the Afghan Eye podcast. He's joining us today from Leiden in the Netherlands. Joining us this morning from Akron, Ohio, is Dr. Karl Kaltenthaler, who is a professor of political science and director of security studies at the University of Akron. And joining us from Kabul, Afghanistan, is Dr. Victoria C. Fontan, who is a professor of peace and conflict studies at the American University of Afghanistan. Victoria, Karl, and Sangar, thank you to all three of you for joining us today. Sangar, let me start with you. Do you think U.S. troops should extend their deadline for remaining in Afghanistan?
Well, thank you for having me. First of all, Waqas, I would say that the reason why the United States and the Taliban decided to negotiate a peace deal was because the presence of foreign forces in Afghanistan is a major factor for instability, for conflict in Afghanistan. So if they stay any longer, it doesn't mean that it will ensure that there's less fighting and less killing. To the contrary, I think that the sooner foreign forces leave, the better for Afghanistan, because while we as Afghans have our own differences and problems that need to be resolved around a negotiating table, the presence of foreign forces creates a situation where we depend on foreign forces for security when there is really much security, and the longer they stay, the Taliban and other groups have reasons to continue fighting.
Victoria, what are your thoughts on that? Because you're on the ground there, right? And just before coming on air, I was reading a report which says the Taliban, in fact, have, in reaction to the Afghan Study Group report, said that they are, in fact, going to pick up their frontline, quote-unquote, activities. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, my thought is that it's not about having troops in or out, but it's about how the withdrawal will take place. At the moment, this May 1st deadline and the negotiated agreement in Doha has emboldened the Taliban and has encouraged them to use violence as leverage and to increase this level of violence. And we can see that every day in Kabul. There's been 2 attacks today already. There are from 1 to 3 attacks per day. And that is not counting what is happening outside of Kabul in the rest of the country. So I would say that, of course, as my colleague just said, international troops have become part of the problem. But I think that the deeper problem is how to continue pursuing a negotiated peace agreement and not just leave and letting Afghanistan fall back into a civil war, which is the result of this report. The report is very clearly saying if there is a hasty withdrawal and a washing of hands, then Afghanistan is going to fall back into a fully fledged conflict. And I think that nobody wants that on the ground.
And Karl, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, what are the U.S. interests here at this time? All these years into the U.S. involvement there in the country, it can be argued in many ways that the United States really, in some ways, has failed, hasn't it?
In some ways, you could say the United States has failed. I mean, the objective was to create a stable Afghan government that had the support of the people. The Taliban would be checked in their attempts to destabilize that government, and that's really not happened. The other thing is the United States wanted to eradicate the presence of Al-Qaeda in the country, and that's also not happened. We know that there's still significant Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, and the Taliban are still linked to Al-Qaeda. So a lot of the conditions that were supposed to be happening in order to execute this full troop withdrawal in May, they just haven't happened. The Taliban has picked up violence against the Afghan government and continues to be in cahoots with Al-Qaeda, despite the Taliban saying that Al-Qaeda doesn't even exist in the country. So you can't really take that as a credible statement on the part of the Taliban. And so this puts the United States in a very difficult political position where the domestic politics of this is for the U.S. government, both Trump and now Biden, was withdraw. But the security situation and what the voices from the Pentagon are saying is the conditions are not right for that. The United States is not secured in its interests by withdrawing under these conditions.
Okay, so Sangar, let's talk, we're spoken about the U.S. interests, but what are the Afghan people's interests in this case, right? I would think, and again, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but do you think that the people are willing to accept that if all foreign forces leave, but there will be a vacuum left behind, right? I mean, so that may very well mean that the Taliban, for example, takes over. Is that going to be a satisfactory outcome?
First of all, I think that what our colleagues have said are based on some of the things that are mentioned in the report. And what the report says is that the Taliban have increased violence and that they have violated the agreement in Doha. These points are very valid points, but we have to also think about how these reports are created. For instance, this report suggests that the Taliban are increasing violence and that the violence in Afghanistan should be decreased as part of the Doha deal. That's not mentioned in the Doha deal. There is no mentioning of reduction in violence. So inherent flaws in the agreement are the reason why we are in this situation right now. With that point out of the way, the Afghan people have an interest in stabilizing Afghanistan and preserving Afghanistan as a nation state without interference from other countries. Generally, people in Afghanistan prefer a government that represents all parts of the society. And what we have to accept, what is often neglected or ignored, is that despite all the problems that we have, Taliban still represent a faction within Afghan society. They represent a part of Afghan society. So if we have a government in future, an independent government, a peaceful settlement in Afghanistan, it is obvious that even the Taliban have to be part of the future government. However, a fait accompli for the Taliban that they take over the entire system and the whole government falls into their hand, I don't think that most people in Afghanistan would like that. And from what I have gathered so far is that the Taliban also don't believe that they should be the sole rulers of Afghanistan in future.
Victoria, that's an interesting point. I mean, do you think in some ways, and again, I don't want to overstate this, but do you think in some ways it's possible for I'm going to say the West in general is trying to project its own ideals and its own utopian vision onto what Afghanistan in its mind should be, regardless of what the Afghan people themselves may want? Because, you know, as Sangar there said, the Taliban does have support, and I mean, it will have to have some role in any future government.
Absolutely, and I'm part of that. My university is a bubble of peace and co-education in the middle of Kabul. I completely understand that. At the same time, I think that it's quite important to understand that Afghan society has changed, even in the countryside since 2001. There is definitely support for the Taliban, but because of a void that the government also has left, and because of an endemic corruption and the fact that the state institutions that have been built since the early 2000s have not been built efficiently. So I think that it's not really a question of, you know, the Taliban being embraced by the population, but it's a question of a political void that has to be filled by a functional liberal system and liberal democracy, and this has not been achieved yet. So I would say that it's really important not to lose the Afghan constitution the Afghan constitution's point of view, and to remember that Afghan society has changed and that the Afghan youth is yearning for peace, development, democracy, and a different way of living.
Karl, I wonder, we have this Afghanistan study group. It's put these recommendations forth, but do you get the feeling that maybe, and I know I'd asked this question in another way from you already, but if we admit that what's been done in all these years has not worked completely, right? Do you think that it is time for a different approach on the part of the U.S., for example, to really help Afghanistan towards a permanent solution? Because, I would think that just being present on the ground for the sake of being present on the ground to say that, hey, we have done our best or we're still here won't be enough.
Well, I think you make a very good point by saying, we've been present on the ground for 20 years. In some ways, things have gotten better. In some ways, things have gotten worse over time. Definitely the stomach in the United States for staying is just not there. So Biden is in a very difficult political situation where, he could keep forces in Afghanistan, 2,500 like are there now, or raise it up to 4,500, something like that. But this is going to be a problem 4 years from now or 10 years from now. The Taliban aren't going anywhere. So the question becomes, how does the United States leave Afghanistan in a stable situation? And almost everybody in Washington who I've talked to says that the only way we can do this is to have a negotiated peace. And so the United States needs to be setting the conditions for a negotiated peace in Afghanistan. But that's very, very difficult to do because, as my colleague was just saying, the United States is seen as, an occupier by many Afghans, as a source of instability. So how does the United States help with negotiations to create a settlement for peace, but at the same time, not be viewed as trying to force peace on the Afghans who probably won't accept that forced peace? So this is a very difficult situation. The Taliban have time on their side. The United States does not have time on its side.
Yeah.
And I think in Washington, that's very clear.
Sangar, I wonder, do you think that the appetite for direct talks between the Taliban and the Kabul government exist on both sides in equal measure? Do you think that both sides are very willing to enter into those talks, that they're willing to compromise in reality?
Well, Waqas, the problem with the negotiations in Afghanistan right now is that on the one hand, we have the Taliban, who are a united front, a united organization, and that's generally often very easy for an opposing party to be very united and very clear about their stance and positions. On the other hand, we have the Afghan government that consists out of many competing groups with competing interests, and together they haven't even reached a consensus on what they really want. For instance, the negotiating team in Doha, some of their members have said that they prefer an interim government or a transitional government as a result of the negotiations in Doha, while the president of Afghanistan, Ashraf Ghani, is vehemently opposed to a transitional government, because that would mean that he have to leave office, or resign, or however you want to call it. But this division on the side of the Afghan government is one of the factors why the negotiations aren't really progressing. And I would say that if the international community has the best interest of Afghanistan in their mind, they should first talk to the Afghan leaders in Kabul and ask them what do they really want, because the negotiations have started and we can't reach any agreement if they have their own internal rifts and conflicts and disputes.
Fair enough. Okay, so we're running out of time, so I wanted to give Victoria and Karl just a minute each if they can summarize their thoughts with us. Victoria, I'll go to you first. On this issue of negotiations, what are your thoughts and what do you hear from around you about the potential for that to actually happen directly, between Kabul and the Taliban?
Well, what I hear is that there's a lot of wariness amongst many observers in Kabul with regards to the way the Afghan government has been unwilling to really get into those negotiations. And we do understand that it was a deal that was imposed upon the government, the actual government. But at the end of the day, this is the best deal that has been brokered in many, many years. And so a negotiated agreement has to be established on the basis of that deal. Otherwise, there are these fears of civil war. So the Afghan government has to step up, unfortunately. And that's really what interlocutors are expecting on the ground and yearning for.
And Karl, I think that sort of pressure will be a lot more than from the Biden administration on the Kabul government to get this done.
Absolutely. I think there'll be a lot of pressure from the Biden administration on the Kabul government to negotiate seriously with the Taliban. I understand the reticence of the Kabul government in some ways to negotiate with the Taliban. The Taliban doesn't recognize them as a legitimate government. They refer to them as puppets. And as Sangar said, that likely if there is some type of interim government that's created, that means Ghani is out. And so one of the things we have seen from presidents in Afghanistan since 2001 is they are very reluctant to leave.
Yeah.
So this is something that's a really thorny issue.
We'll leave there at that, but we appreciate all three of our guests, Karl, Victoria, and Sangar, for sharing their insight with us and putting this all into context for our viewers and myself. The talks at this point between the Taliban and the Kabul government aren't going very well, if they've even really started, if we can be completely honest about that. But for the United States to remain, as Sangar there said, is foreign presence really going to help? But on the other side, the argument is leaving a vacuum in the country a good thing either? What then happens if those talks haven't even really begun directly between these two opposing parties? So we need some form of progress possibly before the world is to step back and say, okay, we'll hand it back to only the Afghan people? Or should we all say, listen, it's the Afghan people who should resolve this amongst themselves in a fashion that they see fit as the population, as the majority who agree with it? Of course, it's not an easy solution in any regard, but something that needs to happen, certainly. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss Syria as well as U.S. relations. Now, Syria's UN mission has said that it is, i.e. the country is willing to better its relations with the United States, but of course with certain conditions. The U.S. should leave Syrian territory, should stop, I should say, exploiting, according to the Syrian UN mission, its natural resources such as oil and gas, and stop support for the Syrian Democratic Forces as well. Is that likely to happen? Probably not, considering the statements of the Biden administration so far. But what other choices really does the United States and do Syria really have to better relations? Or will they continue to be bad going forward as well? And then what does that then mean for the Syrian crisis as a whole also? Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're now joined by Taleb Ibrahim, who is a political analyst, author, writer, and ex-deputy director of the Damascus Center for Strategic Studies. He is joining us today from the Syrian capital, Damascus. Taleb, thank you for your time. What do you make of the possibility of the U.S., withdrawing from Syria at this time? According to the Syrian UN mission, that's the only way for relations to become better.
I think that it will be a very good idea if America will reevaluate its Syrian policies, because there were a lot of terrible mistakes against Syria as a nation and as a state in the past 10 years. And we are very much hopeful that new American President Biden will change those catastrophic policies which destroyed Syria and which brought terrorism to the whole Syrian territories. The best idea is America must withdraw from Syria because they are illegally occupying large parts of Syria, including the most important economic areas in agriculture and in oil, etc., etc. And they are, at the same time, they are imposing illegal sanctions on Syrian government, and which destroy the life lives of millions of people here inside Syria and pushed those rich and poor Syrians to leave Syria because, firstly, of economic situation. I think it is time for America to make this change and to work by it is soft power, not by sanctions and not by military act.
Taleb, I wonder, going forward, where do you see the solution for the Syrian crisis as a whole, right? Regardless of the U.S. involvement or not, there is the Syrian Constitutional Committee, right? Do you think that is making good progress?
I think it was about to make good progress, but what constrained the work of Syrian Constitutional Committee is the foreign intervention. And we heard the UN envoy is talking about that. Frankly, we need that the Syrian Constitutional Commission to work separately and to work in an independent way. And I think from my perspective here in Syria, and I have a lot of friends in opposition and in the Syrian government, if you leave Syrians alone to talk alone without any intervention or any external pressure, I think we can make a new constitution or modify the working constitution, the current constitution of Syria, or making a real political resolution. The problem here in Syria, now Syria became a battlefield for superpowers, Russia and United States, and this could divide the society of Syria and even divided the opposition itself. I think the best way is to make an international conference for Syria in which participate all parties and make a kind of vision or a roadmap to reach a resolution to the Syrian crisis without any external intervention, without any external pressure. If we can do that, I think the solution can be reached in a few weeks or few months. Where is the Syrian population? Where even the Syrian government, which is striving to halt and finish the terrorism, the cancer of terrorism inside many parts of Syria. Yeah. This is a very complicated conflict, and the resolution must be complicated and collective resolution by all parties, regional and international.
But Taleb, you know very well the accusations against Bashar al-Assad as well, right? So there are a number of accusations against him as well of human rights violations during this entire civil war-like situation in the country. Will he be willing to be held accountable if those are proven to be true? And secondly, is he willing to leave power if that is what the Syrian people want at the end of the day?
I think not all Syrians want President Bashar al-Assad to leave power or to be toppled. And I don't think that, and I am sure that 60% of the total population of Syria at least are supporting President Bashar al-Assad. President Bashar al-Assad is fighting terrorism and he is fighting the external intervention in Syria. He is not a war criminal and he didn't commit all what is being said. And I know from my personal experience in the last 10 years that there were a river of lies, endless lies about Syria and about what is going inside Syria. Many lies was about me personally, and even I had been exposed for assassination several times, and the last time they excluded my car because I am talking in the side of the government. I don't think that the opposition itself is a democratic opposition. They committed a lot of war crimes. They had detainees, they beheaded people, they killed civilians, they burned people while they are alive. And we don't think that democracy to Syria can be brought by Al-Nusra Front or by ISIS or by those other extremists. And indeed, they are not Muslim extremists. They are extremists, mercenary extremists working for the behalf of Israel. No one of them is working for the behalf of Syrian population or Syrian opposition. Of course, we have a political national opposition, which we must work with it. And from my perspective, the opposition is a part of the political regime of the country. And it must play an important role in the life and in the planning and in the future for the national state, not to work.
Just tell me, what do you think then happens next, right? After the Constitutional Committee does its work, will the country be able to have free and fair elections? Is that what the next step is?
I think the problem is we can have a free presidential and parliamentary elections here in Syria. And if we will work, and if all Syrian parts work with the United Nations to send envoys to watch those elections, this is one resolution. But do you think that there will be any kind of democratic elections in Idlib, where Al-Nusra Front is seizing a large part of Syrian territories? Do you think that there will be any kind of democratic elections in that? We don't believe that there will be any kind of free election under any kind of occupation, whether it was Turkish occupation or American occupation, or the occupation of the militias like Al-Nusra Front, like ISIS, like Free Democratic Syrian Forces, etc., etc. The most important thing is to end terrorism, to stop the war, and to leave Syria for Syrians, and to send envoys from United Nations to watch those elections, and they will make a report about that. And I think at that point, this is we can reach a kind of transparent and free and trustworthy and confidential election on presidential level and on parliamentary level.
All right, so let's talk about Bashar al-Assad again, if we can, Taleb, because like I said earlier, there's a lot of criticism of him. There's a lot of accusations against him. You're saying that those are all lies. But then at the same time, if at the end of the day, and we all know that he cannot remain in power forever, right? I mean, do you think that after him, that there is a proper process of who is to lead the country next? I mean, does that sort of infrastructure, does that sort of process even exist right now in the country?
I don't think that President Bashar al-Assad is planning to stay in power forever. And he said that, frankly, this is first. Second, he said he will not leave Syria, and he is ready to talk to all of Syrians. And many, as I told you, many Syrians, about 60 to 70% of Syria, look at him as a national hero. And a lot of Arabs, not only inside Syria, millions of Arabs in Egypt, in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Libya, in Algeria, are looking for him as a hero who could fight terrorism, who put an end to the Zionist Arab Spring. And I had heard Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, says in a confession that Israel was behind the Arab Spring, which destroyed Libya, which destroyed Yemen, which destroyed Syria, and even which tried to re-destroy the destroyed Iraq. So I think from the perspective of millions of people, Bashar al-Assad is a hero, even if he's in power or if he's out of power.
Very well. We'll leave it there at that. But Taleb, we as always appreciate your taking your time out to speak to us from Damascus. I know it was tough for us to connect with you, but we appreciate, nevertheless, through all the difficulties, you sharing your insight with us from on the ground there in the Syrian capital. The Syrian UN mission, as I said, has put forth conditions for better relations with the United States. So will the United States play ball? It doesn't seem like it will. Taleb, of course, laid out a lot of the case for the Assad government and why what it is doing is, of course, in his eyes, at least in the eyes of many Syrians, admittedly, certainly, and others around the world, the correct thing at this time, even in this difficult situation. On the other side, as I put to our guest, there are some very serious accusations against Bashar al-Assad himself and his government. How will these two very opposing points of view come together to be able to then resolve the situation peacefully in the country? Is it via the system of the Constitutional Committee, or will there need to be some other mechanism, for example, such as the Astana peace process that Turkey, Iran, and Russia are involved in? We'll, of course, keep a very close eye on that here in Scope. I'll be back with my final segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, in this segment, we're going to discuss white nationalism, white supremacy, domestic extremism, however we want to term it, in the United States. And the U.S. military has acknowledged, ever since this new defense secretary has come into office, that it does have a problem with white nationalism within its ranks, and it will then stand down, i.e., in a sense, pause some of its regular activities for the next 60 days or so, as it figures out, in some ways, how to deal with this, if I may term it, crisis within its ranks. The new Defense Secretary, of course, as we know, is a person of color. He's the first black person, I believe, to be the Defense Secretary of the United States. So hopefully this means that this issue will be dealt with properly. But what does it say overall that we have this issue to begin with within, the ranks of the Pentagon and, and office and soldiers overall? And how exactly then does one deal with this sort of thing overall also? Let's discuss that further. We're now joined by Dr. Shannon Reid, who is assistant professor at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte. She teaches criminal justice and criminology. She's joining us this morning from Charlotte, North Carolina. Shannon, thank you for your time this morning. It's quite the admission, is it not, from the U.S. military that it has this problem, I mean, I imagine that confession was not easy to come by and to come out with that publicly.
Yes, it's a very big step forward for the military and I think for the United States as a whole to say we have this problem and to actually take the time to say we need to pause and really think about how we're going to intervene and deal with this problem.
With a lot of these soldiers, I would think, Shannon, they've served overseas as well, right? So then, and again, I don't want to overstate this, but you would think that, and you would wonder what kind of state of mind were they in then, if some of them, and of course, we're not talking about every single one of them, but even some of them, if they were to have views which are white supremacist in any way, that would affect how they serve, do you think?
Absolutely, and I think that's needs to be part of this study, right, is how many of these individuals are coming in with white power ideologies or sort of white power beliefs, how many are sort of being radicalized within the military, right? They're meeting people and sort of getting these ideas while they're in the military, and then how many are sort of coming back and being not as supported as perhaps they should be and finding solace in this white power movement. But yeah, it's very difficult, especially when we think about how we train soldiers and the otherness that we push, right? The enemy combatant vision of why you're there and what you're meant to do, and the dehumanization that comes along with some of that, because that dehumanization is really pushed in the white power or sort of the radical ideology, right? That these people are other, and therefore not worthy of being treated as equally as another white person should be.
I was reading somewhere, Shannon, and I wonder what your thoughts are on this, that we need, and this was according to an expert that I read in an article, that we need a response to this growing white nationalist, white supremacist ideology, this threat of that we need a response to it in the fashion of the war on terror that was brought forth after 9/11. I mean, that had major issues, right? Human rights, I mean, being the top of the list, certainly. But do you think that that is a good example to be using to fight this as well?
I mean, yes and no. I think it is a much longer term problem than, we want to think about it, right? So this isn't a new, white nationalism in the military is not a new problem. Rather, it's that we are certainly starting to look at it now. But to employ techniques that, have sort of caused so many problems in other countries is not the best idea. Especially since, I study youth involved in this movement, and we know that it's more than de-radicalization, that there are things in youths and individuals' lives that we need to meet. And if we're not meeting those gaps, then whatever sort of counterintelligence, counter-programming put in isn't going to eliminate the problem. It's probably just going to drive it more underground.
At the root of this, Shannon, correct me if I'm wrong, is just racism in some ways, right? I mean, there's that whole ideology that of the replacement, that how the white majority is being replaced by a majority of people of color. And this is not, of course, just true in the United States, but it's true even in parts of Europe as well, from what I've understood. It follows then logically to then say that we need then an anti-racist education platform and just movement going forward?
Racism is certainly a piece of it. I think what is larger is the conspiracy theory part of it, right? So it's more because you will have individuals who are part of these groups say, well, I'm not racist. I have Black friends. I have Hispanic friends. I have international friends. But that doesn't align with the conspiracy theories that are embedded in racism or anti-Semitism that they are then pushing and following. So it's beyond just racism itself. I mean, I think that's certainly a key piece of it, but it almost has more to do with, why are we seeing so many military members latch on to these conspiracy theories to the point where it is changing their outlook on life and their place in the world. So it's almost like, if you join the military for a particular reason, and that particular reason is not one of, it's maybe more of opportunity, right? You needed the job, you needed the money, you need the GI Bill, there aren't opportunities in your town, then is that a place that will allow white nationalism to sort of flourish versus, choosing it because, you felt a strong pull to the cause.
Yeah.
And it may, so therefore, like, you pick up on the racism because it gives you, a reason, an escape reason to be there, right? Like, it may not have been your first choice, but, your circumstances place you in now a position that maybe you don't really want to be in, and putting your life at risk. And so if somebody says to you, oh, the reason we have to do this, or the reason we're stuck in this, place we don't want to be is because of these people, right? Whoever that is.
Yeah.
Then you have a sort of excusable bitterness towards that population.
Understood. Yeah. I wonder, I want to go back to one thing that you mentioned in one of your earlier answers about how white nationalism has been an issue, not just in the military, but just an issue overall for a while now. It's not like it's a new thing. But then I would think then that also then by logic would mean that if this has been an issue for such a long time, then we may very well have very high-ranking people within the Pentagon and in these past years who have those sorts of views. I mean, that would be very tough to hold somebody at a higher level accountable. I mean, if you're talking about younger recruits and the younger members of the military, that's probably easier. But then when you move up the ranks, I would think that would be that much harder. Do you think that the U.S. is willing to do that very tough work at this time?
My honest answer is no. We haven't seen any indication that they are willing, and this is true for law enforcement as well, right? Not just military. We've seen no indication that there is an authentic desire to really dismantle the white supremacy that it sort of infiltrates these organizations. And so, I think it's an important first step to say we're going to, look at this and try and deal with it. But I think the reality is it takes a much larger scale intervention than I think these groups are willing to take, because at a certain point it will be shut down, or they'll only focus on the younger people or, a subset of individuals who maybe are overtly displaying these signs and symbols or behaviors and say, okay, we've dealt with the problem. We've dealt with these individuals, not kind of fully realizing the larger scale of the problem.
Interesting, Shannon. We'll have to leave it there at that, but we sincerely appreciate your taking our time out of your no doubt busy schedule to speak to us this Saturday morning. That was Shannon Reid speaking to us from Charlotte, North Carolina, sharing her expertise with us about, the white nationalism within the ranks of the U.S. military, an issue which is, as she correctly pointed out, of course, is not a new issue, but it's one that at last is seemingly coming into the spotlight, is hopefully going to be dealt with properly. I mean, the U.S. military's confession on this issue is a very big first step, seemingly, but then it has to be followed up by action, right? And as I put to Shannon, you wonder how many of these people who have served overseas have served. What was their ideology? What was their mindset when, for example, they were serving in a country like Iraq, or even if they're currently serving in Afghanistan with that very mindset of white power and white supremacy? How then do they deal with the people around them who they seemingly do not like because they are the other, as Shannon there correctly pointed out, and in their minds that's what they've been brainwashed to believe, right? That the other is the enemy in some ways, enemy combatant, as the term that Shannon used. All of that is very troubling, and one would think that that has affected how these wars have been fought also. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.